بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله الأمين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We begin again in the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, asking Him to send His blessings and peace upon His noble messenger Muhammad and upon all His prophets and messengers whom He sent with guidance and truth and light. And we continue our discussion of the masterpiece of Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah Daraz, An-Naba' al-Azim, or as it's called in English, the Qur'an, an eternal challenge. And until now we have been discussing an introduction to the linguistic or literary miracle of the Qur'an, or the miraculous nature of the Qur'an seen through the lens of its words and its structures and its style and its impact. The words themselves and how those words carry meaning. And to follow on from what we have said already, we come now to chapter 7 of the book, which is called The Secret of the Quranic Miracle. And here the Shaykh has discussed two aspects of this Quranic miracle. The first of these is the sound structure of the Qur'an. The Qur'an is something which is known for its sound and its recitation, to the extent that the name Qur'an, as we said in the first episode, means something which is recited aloud. And any Muslim who wishes to connect with God and to worship God as is pleasing to the Almighty will learn how to recite the Qur'an, even if it be enough to recite the first chapter of the Qur'an in their prayers and to recite some other small chapters. And in doing so will learn how to pronounce the words correctly. And this is according to a science which is known as tajweed. Tajweed literally meaning to make better. It means to make our pronunciation better and to observe the norms of Quranic recitation, which are not even all the same as the norms of ordinary Arabic speech. But there is a unique sound of the Qur'an. And Sheikh Daraz here makes a suggestion to somebody who wants to appreciate this and understand it. He says, find anyone who recites the Qur'an beautifully and as it is supposed to be recited according to the rules of tajweed. Putting aside the question of how beautiful is that individual's voice and how skilled is he in melodic and almost the musical aspects of recitation, but for that person to recite the Qur'an with its letters and with its durations, with its elongation and contraction, following the rhythm of the Qur'an as opposed to anything which is imposed upon it. This is what the science of tajweed dictates. So he says, find such a person, or indeed we may find a recording of the Qur'an, and without any bias, it's the Egyptian reciters of the Qur'an who are foremost in the skill of recitation, such as Sheikh Mahmoud Khalil al-Husari, such as Muhammad Siddiq al-Minshawi, such as Abdul Basit Abdul Samad, and many others who are well known for the art and science of recitation. If you were to listen to one of these from a distance, and this happens as you're walking around in the streets of Cairo, for example, you can hear down the street there is a shop which is playing a recording of the Qur'an. And what you can hear is just a sequence of sounds, a sequence of movement of that sound. And that is something which is unique to the Qur'an. That particular sound is something unique because of the nature of the structure of its words and of its letters. So the Shaykh points out that if we are listening to, for example, some kind of song, it has a melody, a set tune, it also has a set rhythm. If you were to listen to that again and again, eventually you would become bored of it because of the repetition, hearing the same thing again and again. We may like it in the beginning, but then we like it less and less as we listen to it again and again, especially so much at one time. But the Qur'an, because it does not follow a particular set rhythm, because it doesn't follow a meter, which is an external imposed one that we find in music. Instead, it has its own internal rhythm which comes out through the production of its letters. And this is something which is understood by listening to the recitation of the Qur'an. Because of this, it is always fresh, it is always renewed every time that you come to listen to it. And this is something which unfortunately is harder to appreciate in translation. Translation typically, because of its focus upon conveying the meanings, is not able to convey anything from the rhythmic aspects that are present in the words and letters. And that's an inevitable fact. But the Qur'an at the same time is neither poetry nor prose. The Qur'an is not on the meter of poetry, and that's why, as we mentioned before, Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira, when he heard it, had to admit and had to declare to the unbelieving Quraysh that this is unlike all forms and styles of poetry. It is not something which is comparable to the poetry that the Arabs knew. It is not in any of their meters, any of the styles of poetry that they're aware of. And that is why eventually he had to say this is sorcery. Why did he not just say it's prose, it's just ordinary speech? Because the Qur'an also is not just like ordinary prose. Like we said, it is rhythmic. It has some aspects of rhyme, if we may call it that, in its own way. Looking especially at the ends of the verses and the way they correspond to each other. Without being stuck in one pattern, without being bound in that pattern, there is variation and there is unity at the same time. As such, we may say, as the Shaykh has said here, that the Qur'an combines between the best of both. The best of poetry and the best of prose. Shi'r and Nathr. The Qur'an has the freedom of prose, but at the same time the precision of poetry. The Qur'an has the power of prose and at the same time the beauty and the majesty of poetry. So this is something that you can hear even when you are listening at a distance to a recitation, maybe through a wall. But then the Shaykh says, draw nearer to that reciter and listen carefully, and you will hear the perfect balance and the perfect connection and flow of its letters and of its sounds, especially Quranic recitation, in distinction to even ordinary Arabic speech. Don't imagine that just reciting any Arabic speech you would have the same effect. It is not the case. So this is to do with the sound aspect of the Qur'an. But of course, if we are looking at the aspect of the beauty of the Qur'an, we could ask, why is the Qur'an beautiful? What is the purpose of that beauty? And the Shaykh offers a good explanation here when he says, the beauty of the Qur'an is something which ensured its preservation. Because the Qur'an is so beautiful, people wanted to listen to it more. And so when they listen to it, they will listen to its message and they will take on board its guidance. And at the same time, they will make sure to memorize it so that they continue to enjoy it in themselves. And think back especially to a time before there were tape recorders and CDs and MP3s or video. Before any of those existed, and especially amongst people who don't read or write, the most important thing to them when they hear something so overpowering and so beautiful is to memorize it. And when they memorize it, they're carrying with them the teachings of the Qur'an in their chests. Also, this would ensure that it would last through all the generations and all the centuries. God Almighty has promised, and this comes in Surah 15, verse 9, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون. Indeed, we it is who have sent down the remembrance, meaning the Qur'an, and we indeed will preserve it. And one of the ways that God Almighty has preserved it is to place it in the hearts and the chests of the Muslims. As they preserve it, they do hifz, as we say. We describe it in Arabic and other languages as hifz, or as memorization. And that hifz, at the same time, that word means preservation. So they are part of the preservation of the Qur'an by memorizing and reciting it, just as the writing of the Qur'an is a part of its preservation. And these two have never parted from each other since the time of the revelation until today. And the beauty of the Qur'an is something that has made it easier to memorize it. Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ. We have indeed made the Qur'an easy for remembrance. So is there any who will remember, or any who will take heed? So the Qur'an has been made easy to recite because of its beauty. A person who has memorized a chapter of the Qur'an, if he or she listens to the surah, to that chapter being recited by someone else, and they make a mistake, they will immediately notice that it's a mistake, because something is out of place, something is jarring. You have even something which is very subtle, will affect the pronunciation, will affect the balance and the rhythm of that verse, and that person has recited it to themselves so many times, they can hear immediately that there's a mistake. And this is another way that the Qur'an has been preserved. Because nobody could possibly think of even trying to insert something into the Qur'an that doesn't belong to it, or to take something out of it that is part of it. Because everybody would notice. And that is something that goes back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the time of the companions. It's impossible for corruption to have come into the Qur'an because many of them, a great many of them, had memorized the entire Qur'an or had memorized certain chapters of the Qur'an. So how could anyone come with something that wasn't part of it? Then it would be found out and immediately condemned. So this is something which guarantees that nothing will enter the Qur'an that is not part of it. And this is a fulfillment of the promise of Allah, which comes in Surah number 41, Surah Fussilat. لا يأتيه الباطل من بين يديه ولا من خلفه تنزيل من حكيم حميد. No falsehood will ever attain to it or come to it, neither openly or by stealth. Or another way to translate, neither from before it nor behind it. It is bestowed from on high by one who is truly wise, ever to be praised. We may say also about the recitation of the Qur'an that being one of the great features of the Qur'an, it is something which has a great deal of effect upon its listeners. And that's something which is experienced now, is experienced by people as they listen to the Qur'an today, but even more so in the time of revelation. Some of them would hear the Qur'an recited and they would submit to it. We have people like Al-Walid ibn al-Mughira who listened to it and recognized its superiority but didn't submit because of their obstinacy and arrogance. But there were others who submitted open-heartedly. Like the second Khalifa, the second Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, may Allah be pleased with him, he recited the beginning of Surah Taha and was so affected by the words and their nature and their meanings that he became Muslim. While he was on the way to kill the Prophet, then he changed his track and became one of the greatest of all Muslims. There were others who heard the Qur'an being recited, and when the Prophet recited the end of Surah An-Najm, he was reciting chapter number 53 of the Qur'an, and then when he came to the end, there's a verse which says, وَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَاعْبُدُوا. Prostrate to Allah and worship, meaning worship Him. And there were a group of unbelievers around listening to his recitation while he was not, while they were not in open, but they were listening quietly to his recitation. And when he came to that verse and recited it, they all fell prostrate. This is the effect of recitation. Among the believers, there are some who, when listening to recitation of the Qur'an or reciting the Qur'an in the prayer, they would faint. Or even there are cases where somebody was reciting the Qur'an and just fell dead, being overpowered by its meanings and overpowered by its words. So there is a great deal to be known and explored in the sound of the Qur'an.